Ruth Roper Wylde is a partially retired civil servant living in Bedfordshire, UK, with her husband and her dog. Where's the dog? We haven't seen the doggy yet.
He's under the table, actually.
Ah, well, when he appears, I want to see him. Much of her career was spent as an investigator in fraud, theft, and later in bullying, harassment, discrimination claims. She has a lifelong fascination with the supernatural and unexplained, stemming from her formative years living in a house with an active poltergeist in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. It wasn't me. I was not that poltergeist. Though I'm also from Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. In fact, we went to the same school, didn't we, Ruth?
We did.
Yeah.
Not at the same time, I don't think, but we were at the same
No,
school.
we missed each other by a few years. As a hobby, therefore, over the years, she's researched for endless hours on the subject with the idea of eventually writing a book. She brings a healthy dose of skepticism and desire for scientific explanation to her research and writing, which was instilled by her ever pragmatic mother. When first presented with an inexplicably flying knife in the kitchen, she calmly took out a tape measure and measured the length of its flight path. If she measured the flight path and the weight, she could, of course, do. Anyway, I can see why she did that. Yeah. 7 years later, when the opportunity to take partial early retirement presented itself, Ruth decided to make her idea of writing a book into reality, and she's published 6 books as an independent author. The Ghosts.
9 now.
Oh, okay, 9 books. This is out of date. 3 books since we last saw you. The Ghosts of Marston Vale, The Almanac of British Ghosts, These Haunted Times, volumes 1, 2, and 3.
And
The
4.
British Ghost, volumes 1 and 2. So we've also got These Haunted Times, volume 4, because it came out at the same time as 3, I believe, didn't it?
It was about 8 or 9 weeks later, because I went
'Cause you
slightly mad last year and wrote 2 at once.
I remember you saying you'd written them both. And when you're researching, you check if there's any evidence that the phenomena is still happening. So your books are not filled with out-of-date material, but are bang up to date and well worth reading. If you'd like to contact Ruth, she's on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, LinkedIn, or you can email her at ruthroperwylde@gmail.com. I'll drop that now into chat just so that people who are here can see it and can. I would drop it into chat if I could work out how to use my own computer. Here we go. There we go. And I would greatly encourage you to have a look at Ruth's books, which are available on both Kindle and also available through amazon.co.uk. We'll share some links for that at the end. So thank you very much indeed. And from this point onwards, it's over to Ruth. Ladies and gentlemen, Ruth Roper Wylde.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's nice to see such a full house. I always hate it when I turn up somewhere to talk and there's like 6 people in the front row. Or as once happened when I agreed to do a talk for an old people's home, everybody was asleep before I even started the meeting, which was a bit daunting to talk to a room full of fast asleep elderly pensioners. But we carry on. So there we go. I'm hoping that my technology will bear with us tonight. So do shout out or put something on the chat if it starts to struggle. But fingers crossed, because I'm on my phone rather than the computer, it might manage to do it. So what I've done tonight, because last time I spoke to you a bit about what my methodology is and the databases I've kept over the years and still keep up. So what I've done tonight is choose a selection of actual stories from the 2 most recent make sure power cable is plugged in. Unfortunately, I can't plug that in at the same time as the headphones. There we go. So we're just going to have to hope it stays in power. Just chosen some entries from the latest 2 books, which is These Haunted Times, Volume 3 and Volume 4, to share with you, and then a little bit about what I'm working on now for this coming year. So as Christian just alluded to, I went slightly insane last year and accidentally wrote 2 books at once. And trust me, it is possible to write 2 books accidentally at once. Because what happens with my writing is I start with a source story that I found somewhere that has caught my interest because it's happened within my lifetime. That's kind of my criteria. And I'm getting quite old now, so that's quite a long span of years. And then I go out in the local area to try and find anybody who's got correlations of something happening in the same place. And I'm very careful when I go out not to lead with what exactly I'm looking for. Obviously, I'm telling them I'm looking for paranormal occurrences or things I can't explain and the location, but I don't tell them what's supposed to be haunting it. So if, for example, it's a road that's supposed to be haunted by the spectre of a black monk, then I won't put that in the requests that I put out. I'll just say, has anybody experienced anything they can't explain or seen a ghost or anything along this stretch of road or in this building or whatever. And last year I had not long put out Roadmap Fish Ghost Volume 2 and was thinking, what shall I do next? And had a little dig around in the database that These Haunted Times comes from. I thought, oh, that's kind of filled itself back up from people writing into me. I better stick out of These Haunted Times Volume 3 and empty that database before I think of venturing onto something new. So I merrily started emptying that database onto paper and going out and doing the research and having all these people writing to me and responding and what have you. And I was happily tapping away for several months like this when my computer suddenly said, you have reached the Google document word limit at 696,000 words. At which point I thought, crikes, you can't put out a book that's 696,000 words. Nobody would ever be able to afford to buy it because it would take so many pages to print it. So then I thought, oh, never mind, I'll just split it into 2 books, be easy. Trust me, people, if you're thinking of writing a book, it is not easy because you suddenly realise as you do it that you've got to make sure that there's an equal smattering of really strong stories to weaker stories, that there's an equal smattering across the country, that you're not putting out a book that's only Kent and calling it, covering the British Isles when it's in fact only got Kent or somewhere in it. So you have to then create another database and colour code it to show which entry's gone in which book and whether it's wrong, weak or strong, and whether, what county it's in, and then you've got to count how many counties you've got in each. Oh, it's a nightmare. But I persevered, and These Haunted Times Volume 3 came out in towards the end of September last year, and Volume 4 came out beginning of December last year. So we got there in the end. So I just wanted to share with you tonight some stories from that I've picked out because they sort of highlight a particular way in which I do things. So we're going to start with a modern housing estate in Wiltshire. So those of you in Wiltshire can all cheer. You're getting a bit tonight. It's actually in Amesbury, and it's called the Archer's Gate Estate. So I had picked this story up from somebody else's book, from Selina Wright's book, Paranormal Wiltshire, which was first published in 2014. And she'd included a story in there that there was a housekeeper called Sarah Jane who was doing her housekeeping duties at her property on Allington Way in Amesbury. And that one afternoon, she was working away in the kitchen, happens to glance out of the kitchen window, or says she felt compelled to look out the kitchen window, just in time to see a figure walk past the window, which was coloured entirely in white. There was no colour in it at all. So not wearing something white, the whole figure was white. So if you imagine sort of the opposite of a dark shadow figure, it's a white shadow figure. And she says that he was staring in at her as he walked past the window. Now, in the book, she's described as saying that apparently she thought he looked like an archer dated from the Bronze Age. That he had long hair tied in a ponytail at the nape of his neck, and it scared her badly the way that he seemed to be looking at her. Now, this is what caught my attention, because my first thought on reading that was, how on earth would your average person think that person looks like an archer dated from the Bronze Age? I'm not even sure they had a profession of archers in the Bronze Age. People used archery to survive, obviously, and no doubt to fight and what have you. But I don't think you would say somebody was an archer as opposed to a fighter or a warrior or a hunter or, all the other things they had to do to survive. So that seemed like a strange description to me. So I went out as I normally do. First thing I did was sort of Google it and search it. And within minutes, you can find out that the opposite side of Allington Way, this new estate was built called Archer's Gate. So on one side of Allington Way, there's the older style properties, quite big properties that probably would need a housekeeper. On the other side is more modern, 3-bedroom detached, semi-detached houses, that kind of thing. And the reason they were called Archer's Gate is because when they were doing the archaeological survey of the land prior to building the properties, they found this burial that had some of the richest gold grave goods ever found in, British archaeology. And they dated it back to the Bronze Age, and it was a male who had spent, with the DNA testing they were able to do, had spent most of his formative years growing up in Europe. He died at around 45 years old from the state, age of the skeleton. And they dubbed him the Amesbury Archer because arrowheads were found buried with him, plus wrist guards, which an archer would have worn. So therefore, the skeleton got the name of the Amesbury Archer, and hence they named the housing estate after this finding. Now, this housing estate was built in May 2002. So by the time this lady saw this ghost in 2014, that had already been all over the papers in Amesbury about the find in the archaeological research when they started building this housing estate. So that's obviously why she thought she'd seen the archer, because she already knew there was supposed to be a bronze archer. Well, not supposed to be, there was a Bronze Age man dubbed the archer buried there. Interesting, they also found a younger man skeleton close to him, who was maybe only 25 years old, and DNA testing showed that they were related, and related close enough that it was perhaps his son. And the 25-year-old was born and raised in the UK. So quite what killed them both, fairly close to each other by the looks of things, we'll never know. But it does look like the original archer moved over from the continent and settled down and married and had at least one child here. So then I went out, having found that history, I went out as I usually do on social media, joined as many local social media sites as I could lay my hands on, and asked for people's, have you got anything unusual happening in your house around Amesbury, particularly around the Archer's Gate estate area. And this was one of those cases where just so many people got in touch with me. It was getting hard to keep track of, frankly. And very quickly shows that there's a very, very active paranormal area. So one lady told me that in 2020, her grandmother, who lived alone, had gone to use her dishwasher as usual in the evening, but for some reason it wouldn't turn on. Those of you currently having hot water problems will no doubt feel sympathy with this. Emma, confused about, you looked at her as if it was a totally white figure, couldn't see. I'm confused about that as well, but perhaps it was the turning of the head or something, who knows. So yes, this grandmother couldn't turn her dishwasher on, so spoke to her granddaughter, who said, I'll be around in the morning to have a look at it. So the next morning they turn up and they pull it out of the alcove that the dishwasher is under, as you can imagine, to find that the power cable had been neatly unplugged from the wall and wrapped around the cleats at the back of the dishwasher, and the hose had been detached and also neatly wrapped. And yet there's no way grandmother had the strength or the ability to have been able to move that dishwasher herself. Simply not possible. And they've not been able to explain how that happened, because she'd been using the dishwasher daily up until this point. And when they duly plugged it back in and reconnected everything, it worked fine again. Another lady told me that she has crazy things happening in her house all the time. She lives in a detached house, and this is an important bit of information, because she will hear knocking against the walls as if from outside or as if from an adjoining house, except there isn't an adjoining house. And they hear footsteps crossing their loft upstairs. In their kitchen, items will move across the work surface by themselves. And both of these people, the lady with the grandmother and this lady with the things happening in their house, told me that they had never believed in the paranormal. They had no interest in the paranormal. This was only something that started happening when they moved into these houses. A third lady told me that she also experiences bangs and footsteps in her house. And she too has items moving around in the kitchen. And she also notices that quite often, if you're in a room, the door handle will depress downwards as if somebody's trying to open the door. This third lady told me that on one occasion, her daughter, Carly, just a side note here, I nearly always use pseudonyms because people don't like to have their own names used, as I'm sure you'll understand. So please just understand that they're pseudonyms that I'm using. So this lady's daughter, Carly, was in her bedroom one evening, FaceTiming, just like we're doing on a phone now, with a friend, and wanted to go downstairs and get a snack or whatever. So she popped the phone down on the bedside cabinet, facing upwards, with the friend still connected on the video. And while they were downstairs, both Carly and her mother heard this almighty bang from upstairs and thought, what on earth was that? So they both went up the stairs to investigate, and they found the phone lying on the opposite side of the bedroom on the floor. So she picks it up, discovers that her friend is still connected by FaceTime, and her friend was able to report that from her end, she saw the phone move upwards and then her view tumbled, if you know what I mean, because the video actually videoed the phone tumbling through the air and landing on the carpet. So she actually saw that happen on the video, but not what caused it. Which I think is an absolutely fantastic bit of evidence. Another lady got in touch. She told me that she'd lived in her house for 15 years and she hadn't ever experienced anything. So, and she was not aware of those archaeological findings and didn't know anything about the archer and was interested about why it was called Archer's Gate. Which just goes to show that my assumption that people have heard about it isn't necessarily true. Then another lady contacted me, Tanya. She herself is a medium, and she'd had some activity going on in her house. So her daughter left a video running in the room to see if it would capture anything when they were out. And when they looked back over the footage, they could clearly see that at one point, an unknown woman pokes her head into the room from the doorway into the hall, appears to realise she's being seen, and quickly dashes her head back out of view again. And when you play the video in slow motion, you could see the hair swishing. You know, the video capture was good enough. You could see the long hair swishing. Now, Tanya was actually able to show me this video. She was actually able to send it to me. And it really is very creepy. You know, you can see that it's just a locked off camera and a dark shadow shape pokes its head round the door of the room and then suddenly jerks backwards as if it's realised it's being captured. And you can clearly see the hair swishing. So whatever it was had long hair. And not surprisingly, her daughter refused to sleep in that room again. Another witness, she had to have her house cleared by a blessing to stop the activity because it was so frequent. And she'd also, as well as living on the New Arches estate, she'd also lived on Allington Way, the original street that we were talking about, for a time. And she had activity there too, because one of her daughters was often disturbed in her bedroom by the sound of disembodied voices within the room. Somebody else confirmed that they too had heard disembodied voices in their house. And then a chap called Mark got in touch with me about his strange experiences. Now, he lives in the Kingsgate area of the estate. One part is called Archer's Gate, the other part is called Kingsgate. He moved into his house in 2016, and he moved in with his girlfriend. First 18 months or so, totally quiet, nothing happened. But then he started to experience seeing the apparition of a young girl out on his landing. He's aware that he's quite perceptive to the paranormal, especially when he's in a slightly drowsy state, you know, about to go to sleep. But he knows he's not yet asleep because he has a system of interacting with his girlfriend for her to take notes of what he's seeing and experiencing. So they both know he's awake and responding to her, but it's at that time of night when you're getting a bit drowsy. The first time he saw the apparition, she was standing out on the landing, and he had the strange feeling that he knew her somehow. He said she looked to be around 12 years old, seemed to be wearing some kind of long night dress. And whenever he sees her, she's in monochromatic shades. There's no colour to it, just greys and blacks and whites, but no colour. And each time he saw her, he didn't see her every night, obviously, but every time he saw her after that first time, she'd moved one step closer to the bedroom that he was lying in with the door to the landing open. And he has a feeling, because he believes in past lives, that she might have been a childhood friend from a previous life. So it never felt like it was anything frightening to him. But he does say he got a bit annoyed the night she actually came into the room and knocked over a glass of orange juice at the side of the bed. Mark's father is a dowser. I'm sure I don't need to explain to this group what a dowser is. I have to for some group. And he uses dowsing rods to communicate with the spirit world, using them to say yes or no with the direction the rods are moving. So they've set up a system where Mark never tells his father what he's seen, but his father comes round and asks a series of yes or no questions to the rods until he gets an answer for what Mark thinks he's seeing, if you see what I mean. And he has been able to interact with this young girl, and she's communicated that she's happy to stay out on the landing if that's where they prefer she to stay, and that landing is easier for her to access anyway, because some places spirits find easier to access than others. And the landing in this house, for some reason, is one of these, if you like, liminal spaces. After a while, when this had been going on for a while, other figures started appearing upstairs, as if they were sort of attracted to the energy that was going on there. In 2020, Mark said to me that he had one that looked more monsterish in its appearance, and it came actually into his room from the landing and hovered over me while I was laying in bed. He could only see its head and shoulders, and we were talking on the phone, but he was really struggling to find a way to describe it to me, because obviously being an author, being a writer, I wanted a really, really clear description so as I could put it into words. And he was really struggling to put into words something that isn't explicable in our world, if you see what I mean. He said the best he could come up with was it was slightly demonic looking, a bit werewolfish, and difficult to make out what it was trying to manifest as. You know, you couldn't really place it in any one category, and the whole experience only lasted 2 or 3 seconds. I asked him how his family felt about this gift, and he said his girlfriend's quite cool with it. She'll help by asking questions when he's seeing something and making sure he gets an accurate rendering written down of what he's seeing. But she doesn't see, hear, or sense anything there. It's Mark that seems to have the ability. He personally has no particular belief system, so he feels quite calm about what he's seeing. He just takes it as an interesting occurrence, if you like. He said that in 2020, a couple more human-type figures wandered in for a couple of seconds, and then they had a period of about 18 months where nothing happened. At that point, he saw the young girl one more time, and then it stayed quiet for another year or so. And then in late 2022, the activity started up again, and this time a young woman of around mid-20s in age appeared on the landing and looked in through the bedroom door. And he's often wondered whether it's actually the same spirit but manifesting as an older part of their life, if you see what I mean, because it's got that same friendly feeling about it. A few days later, so this is still in 2022, the same woman came back, held her hands out towards him from the bedroom doorway, and released what he said looked like round balls of smoke, which drifted towards him and then faded out before they reached him. And he has no idea what that was about or what the significance of that might be. On another occasion, a different figure appeared, and this time he and his girlfriend sat up in bed and used a pendulum to try and ask it some questions. And they say they were able to ascertain that the person said they died around 400 years ago. I've actually got quite a dim view of pendulums, I have to say, because I found very quickly that you can easily manipulate them without even meaning to with your hand. And it's the tiniest movement of a muscle will make one swing. and you can change its direction of swing. And it's once you practice it, you can actually get it to do very easily. But the other problem I have with it is I've seen people using it a lot and get very excited about using it. And they tend to ask a string of questions at once. And of course, it can only give a yes or no answer. So if you ask 3 or 4 questions on the trot and it answers yes, you've no real way of knowing which of those questions it just said yes to. And I've quite often seen people sort of asking a serious question, then asking the question they're most interested in as the last question. And actually, this is a trick you learn in investigative interviewing as well. So, of course, when it says yes, they assume it's saying yes to that question they were most interested in, which means without meaning to, they're leading the evidence. So, yeah, I think you have to be very, very careful with yes-no type scientific methodology. Mark says his experiences seem to be being more intense as time goes on. And his dad has said that sometimes now the dowsing rods are acting oddly round at Mark's house. They won't respond properly and just kind of go a bit mad as if there's an energy there that's somehow blocking what they normally do. On one occasion, he had a human figure walk right up to his bed and try to hand him what he said looked like one of those child's toys that used to be all the rage called a Furby. I don't know if anybody remembers them, but they were like little hairy, gonky type things. And they were all the rage, maybe early 80s, something like that. And they tried to hand it to him, but of course couldn't because it wasn't a real one. And they sort of disappeared with a loud crack that sounded like electricity cracking. Interestingly, in January 2023, Mark had to stay away in a hotel for his job, and he actually saw a couple of figures standing at the end of his bed there as well. So it begins to seem as if it's Mark himself that is attracting the activity. One of the figures was male, the other was female, and the male seemed to be in quite a state of distress, had his mouth open as if he was screaming, whereas the female seemed very calm. But again, the whole experience was only a couple of seconds long. And then just a week before I interviewed him, which would have been in mid-2023, he'd seen what he described as the best description he could come up with was a Grim Reaper type figure. So seeming to be male, hood up, skull where the face should have been, wasn't carrying anything, but reached its left hand towards Marky's bed. And as he reached his hand out, the hand seemed to separate from his body and float towards him. And he said, this is Mark's word, he said, I feel kind of stupid telling you this, but I feel it's really important I tell you exactly what I experience and don't try and either embellish it or try and hide it when it sounds as stupid as this. But he says that he felt to him like there was some sort of symbolism at play with the detaching hand, but he has no idea what that symbolism might be. And then I had one final lady contact me and said they keep hearing banging, like something's jumped onto the landing in their house. And she'd, on one particular occasion, it's a 3-story house, theirs. She'd called up the 3 flights to her daughter, who she thought was banging around upstairs. And she heard her daughter reply back, couldn't quite make out what she said. And she was really quite annoyed that her daughter had just yelled back instead of at least coming to the stairwell and yelling down the stairwell, which would have helped. So she rang her daughter's phone to say, come down and talk to me. Her daughter answered the phone and wasn't even at home. So who that was yelling from upstairs, she never did find out. There were a couple more from there, but I'm going to move on to look at some other entries from the book. I'm going to move on to volume 4 now. And this was an example I just wanted to give you of when people get in touch after they've heard me speaking on something like this. So I'd made an appearance on Howard Hughes's show on Talk Radio sometime last year, where I talked about Dover Castle in Kent, because a friend of mine had visited there in 2001. And she'd gone on holiday on her own on a camping trip. She decided she'd go to Dover Castle because obviously it's so interesting. She herself is a nurse, so she was particularly interested in seeing the underground tunnels that were used during World War II, and particularly interested in seeing the parts that were used as a makeshift hospital and so on under there. So she went on the guided tour, but was hanging around at the back of the group as they moved through the tunnels because she wanted a bit more time to herself to actually look at all the exhibits. As they moved through one point, there were a point where the tunnels crisscrossed each other. My friend's at the back of the group has moved across this cross section. And as she goes to move across it, she hears brisk footsteps, turns to look, and sees a gentleman in full naval officer's uniform stride out of this side tunnel, make a sharp right turn and start to walk away from her. At which point she thinks, he must be a member of staff dressed up in period, costumes to make it more realistic. Because she described him as being very present, entirely normal, could have reached out and touched him, nothing untoward about him at all. And the only thing that made her realise she was looking at something paranormal was that as he started to walk away from her, he just blinked out, faded from view as he walked away. And she was just left standing open-mouthed at this tunnel entrance thinking, what on earth did I just experience? So I'd mentioned this on the radio show, and after the show, a chap called Ian wrote to me and said, while watching your interview on the Unexplained, I was intrigued by your various sightings at the Welsh village, which I've been talking about. I thought about the possibility of sending you details of a supernatural experience I once had in order to find out if anyone else had contacted you about the same thing. And then you moved on to Dover Castle tunnels. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because that was what I was about to write to you about. So whilst on holiday in Kent, Monday the 14th of August 2006, he too had gone on a guided tour of the tunnels. He was at the back of the party because he, again, didn't want to be rushed. They were walking down one of these long tunnels when the party turned off down another tunnel on the right, which was a tunnel that led to another open work area. But as he went to turn off, again trailing behind the group, he saw what he thought was an Air Force officer wearing an officer's type hat, walking across the tunnel he was in from left to right, which suggested to him there was another tunnel running at right angles to the tunnel he was in, like another T-junction. And this officer too was also carrying a folder or clipboard, which my friend had seen him carrying. He stopped for a moment, this figure, and looked down the tunnel at Ian just for a moment and then carried on and disappeared from view. Something about it struck him as odd. So when he got home, he did some internet research and discovered that quite a few people have seen this figure. And some people on the internet forums that he checked on had expressed an opinion that maybe the people who own Dover Castle have put some sort of projector up at the end of the tunnel to project this figure to give people a bit of a thrill, if you like. And he and I had quite a discussion about this backwards and forwards because my point was my friend saw it turn a corner. And I think you'd have to have some very fancy electronics to make an apparently solid figure turn a corner in front of somebody. And he was wondering, well, maybe they only do it to the last person in the group to make it more spooky. And my point was, why on earth would you spend that much money on electronics and then only spook one person in each group? To me, that didn't make sense. And I did ask him whether he'd thought of writing to English Heritage, who own it, to ask them. And he did say, do you know what? I'm going to go and do that. I'm going to go and write to them. I'm going to ask them whether they've got anything. Unfortunately, he never got back to me. So I don't know whether he ever got an answer. I'm assuming not, or I'm assuming he would have got back to me to say, yes, actually, it was just a projector. But I still think it very unlikely that you would have anybody, set up that kind of electronics. Do feel free to stop me if I talk for too long, by the way, because as anybody who's seen me talk before, I can just talk for hours on this subject. I did just want to talk to you about a really sweet little story. This was given to me by a correspondent who had been given it firsthand themselves. So although it's third hand to me, it was first hand to them, if you see. And this happened at near Loch an Ordain in Scotland. Sorry if I've pronounced that badly, which is near ASSAP. And this was a shepherd who'd gone onto the high mountains to gather his sheep down on a winter's afternoon, because when it gets near the bad point of winter, they bring the sheep down off the high ground. And he was walking behind the flock, as you do. I don't know if you've ever seen them do the gather, but a sheepdog usually rounds them up off the top of the mountains onto a lane of some sort, and then they walk calmly down that with the shepherd and the dog walking behind them. So he was walking down this path. Now, this path happened to take him past what used to be a proper old Scottish crofter's cottage, but at some time in recent years had been renovated and done up to become a holiday home. So it's now, a remote holiday let. But because it's as remote as it is and up this path, it's very rarely ever let out in winter, because there would be the problem of people getting stuck up there. So he knows that the property usually stands empty at winter. But if you can imagine the picture, there he is, walking through the sort of gathering gloom. He's got a sheep ahead of him, they're all barring. And he realises he can suddenly hear music and laughing and chatting, like there was some kind of full-blown party going on at this crofter's cottage. And he thought to himself, well, that's really odd, because they don't normally let that out at this time of year. I wonder if it is let out, or has somebody broken into it and is having a bit of a party. So he thought, I'll just have a sneaky shufty and a little look at that. So as the sheep went on past down the lane, he turned into the property, intending to creep up to the windows and have a look to see who was, in there, and try and suss out whether it was legitimate or not. But literally the movement, he put his foot across the property line. The moment he did that, the music stopped, the sound of voices stopped, total silence, only the sound of the wind, the mountain, his sheep. And it was obvious that the cottage was actually standing there, locked up, cold, empty, nobody in it. And he just was left dumbfounded, stood on the side of this mountain, again, thinking, what on earth did I just experience? As he put it, he hurried on and left it well alone, with perhaps sometimes the wiser course of action. And that put me in mind of another short story I had. And this was about a property in Hertfordshire. It used to be called the Bell Inn, but it's long since stopped being a pub. And I believe now is a private property. And it's in a small village called Wylde in Hertfordshire. But my correspondent Marcus wrote to me to say that when it was still a pub, years and years and years ago, it was owned by his grandparents. And one night, they'd locked up at the end of the evening session, gone to bed, and they were rudely awoken in the wee small hours of the morning because their son, who later on would become Marcus's uncle, came home from a night out with the lads from his rugby team. And much to the annoyance of his parents, brought home the lads from the rugby team. And they came into the bar and started having a right old knees up. And of course, his grandparents were furious. They hadn't agreed to this, and they weren't going to stand for it. So they both got out of bed, put the dressing gowns on, stomped off down the stairs to tell their son to quiet it down and turf his friends out. Opened the door to the bar area where this full-blown raucous party was going on. And as they opened the door, everything went silent, and they were left staring at a dark, quiet, locked-up pub, exactly the way they'd left it, and their son hadn't even returned home yet. So whatever it wasn't their son, and it wasn't his rugby team that had come home. Marcus's mother said to him, because obviously she grew up there, that there was also the ghost of a small girl there, and she had, when she was living there, she'd heard this little girl calling out her name. and that this little girl spirit was quite mischievous and would do things like switch off the machines or switch it back on when nobody was near it. And the whole family would hear the sound of horses' hooves clip-clopping down the lane outside the pub quite regularly. But the interesting thing was that it sounded like they were clip-clopping on an old cobbled surface rather than the modern day tarmac road that was actually outside the pub. So it was as if they were hearing a playback of a sound from long ago, not something actual physical going down the lane as it was now. It'd be quite interesting to get a hold of the people who live in the property now, I guess, and ask them whether they ever experience anything. But it always feels rather rude to me to go and knock on somebody's door and say, excuse me. I'm sure the people do it, but I don't think we should be doing that. I just always live in hope that the people who live there now might one day hear me speaking, or one day read one of my books, go, hang on a minute, that's our house, and write to me to say, whether or not anything's happening. And curiously, I did have something like that happen with the property that I grew up in a child with the poltergeist. We had a very active poltergeist in that house, used to throw things about quite regularly, turn lights on and off, turn the cooker on and off. On one occasion, it happily folded a tea towel up in front of me and my mother as we were clearing up the tea things. I literally folded it once that way, and then once that way until you ended up with a neat little square while we watched on in astonishment in broad daylight. And I had gone out on social media, just curious really, as I normally do with all the other accounts I find, to say, has anybody had any strange experiences in this particular road where the house was? And one person got in touch with me and said, I'm very curious that you've asked about this road. It's a very small cul-de-sac, and I know everybody who lives in it, and nobody's had any paranormal experiences. So we were messaging backwards and forwards, and so I said, really? So nobody's had anything at all? She said, no. She said, can I ask you which property you were talking about? I said, well, yeah, I'll tell you, seeing as, I'm not publishing it, but, it was number whatever. And she said, well, I know the family that lives there. They lived there for 25 odd years. Thanks, Richard. Take care. They've lived there for, 20 odd years. And before them, there was the such and such a family. And before them, there was the Wyldes. And none of them ever mentioned ever having a ghost. And it obviously hadn't clicked with her that she was talking to a Ruth Roper Wylde, and mentioning that it was the Wyldes that had lived there. And I thought, well, that's really strange. We obviously didn't say anything at the time, and I was a child at the time. So I did actually ask my childhood friend from back then, did we ever tell you about the poltergeist while we were there? And she said, no, you never did. You never mentioned it while we lived there. Said you told me about it in later years, and obviously I now hear you talk about it all, and I know you put it in your books now. She won't read my books, by the way, because she's too scared of ghosts. But she said you never spoke about it at the time, because if you had done, I would have refused to come round and play. And I thought, well, that's probably my answer as to why we didn't talk about it much, because we knew that people wouldn't want to hear that they were coming into a house with a active poltergeist. So it was quite a lesson in just how many places that are there around Britain where things are happening every day and families are living with them that aren't even mentioning it to their nearest and dearest, and close friends, for fear of either how the people might ridicule them, or for fear of how the people themselves might be too frightened to come round and visit them anymore. So they just don't mention it outside the family circle. And it does make you wonder just how many properties out there are every day having, paranormal activity that just doesn't get talked about outside of the property. And does make it, of course, then difficult to discover whether or not there's any further correlation, because that, when you think about it, that didn't tell me anything about whether there's any correlation for that haunting, because that individual didn't know there'd been a haunting originally. So the subsequent families after us may also have stayed silent, for all we know, or they might not have experienced anything. We won't know the answer to that. And I wonder how often that happens all the time. And I think that in itself, in a nutshell, tells you why I end up writing 2 books at once, because I just can't leave this subject alone. And whenever I find, an interesting little story, I have to try and track it down, and I have to try and see whether anybody else has experienced it. And my books are chock-a-block full of people's own accounts. And like that one I just described to you in Amesbury, quite often there's lots of people having experiences in one area when they do start to engage with me. And I have an absolute strict rule that I will not embellish what they tell me. This is why I publish independently, which any of you that publish will know. You make very little money out of publishing independently. There's no big money in it the way there is for authors that have a publishing house. But by publishing independently, I have control over the content of the book, which means that they cannot be sexed up to seem to be, more exciting or more scary or whatever. I've actually got an account in one of my books where somebody has told me that the reason they think their flat is haunted is because the Pringles tube that was standing in their lounge one evening fell over. That was it. Pringles tube fell over. But that was their experience, and they felt it fell over in such a way that they couldn't explain it. So that's what I report, because that's what they've told me. I don't try and look to try and, make it more scary than it is. And like I say, I have a strict rule on that. So going forward this year, I did take a little bit of a break. Those of you that know me well will know that I say that every year and promise that myself that I'm going to take a little break after I hit the publish button. And then about 12 hours later, I'm fiddling with the databases and just getting hooked again. I did actually take about a 3 or 4 week break this time after publishing Haunted Times 4. Because I wasn't feeling very well, funnily enough. And then I ended up in hospital. And by the time I was well enough from that to pick up again, I'd actually had a longer break than I'd expected, so 2 or 3 months. And during that time, I've had to think about what I want to do next. And I've certainly got enough in the database to do These Haunted Times 5, because one of the things that happens is as I publish a book, people start writing to me with their experiences, and that fills the database back up. It's like painting the fourth bridge. But I've also got a bit of a hankering to have a look at American hauntings, American spirits. So at the moment, I'm doing a load of research and reaching out to people in America. And I was a bit worried that I would get a different reception out there, because when you watch American shows on telly, there's an awful lot of portals and demonic this, that, and the other being shouted about. But so far, so good, touch wood, she said. A lot of people are getting in touch and giving me their stories, and they're very similar to the accounts that we have over here. They sometimes put a slightly different spin on it. I get a lot of, we think our land must have been over an Indian burial ground. There seems to be a lot of that. But I've just had a very interesting conversation with a lady who lives in a trailer home at the side of a highway, and her trailer is haunted. There's a lot of figures that she sees. She's even managed to capture photographs of them, and they're quite often, the figure will reflect in a shiny surface as it goes past it. So she's got one of those big American style stainless steel fridges. And she's actually captured the picture of the reflection the figure leaves as it passes by, which is interesting. But she did tell me an interesting little snippet. Obviously, she tells some people about the hauntings, but not everybody. A lot of people think she's mad. She was quite glad to find somebody to talk to. We had quite a good long video chat. And she was saying that one of her work colleagues gave her a lift home one day from work. Was, a little bit remote where her trailer is. And as they were pulling up and turning into where the trailer is, her work colleague was like, "Oh, there's somebody home waiting for you, look." And she said, "Sorry, what do you mean?" She said, "Oh, there's somebody home waiting for you. See them in the front window." And she said, so I started chuckling, and as the car got closer to the trailer, I said, "Now look again and tell me whether there's somebody standing in that front window." And the driver looked again and said, "Oh, because the front windows of the trailer are boarded up with wood. So there's no way you could have seen somebody standing in the window because it's wood." So she said that, she was sure that as they turned around, she'd seen a figure standing in the window, even though the window isn't there anymore. So that's quite an interesting one. I'm going to shut up now before you all fall asleep on me and just open it out a bit, if that's okay, Christian, to see if anybody's got any questions or anything. It's okay to do that.
Right. Questions. Can everybody hear me?
I can.
Okay. We are ready to go. Who's got the first question, if we have any so far?
Oh,
Yes.
thanks, Patricia.
Okay. I heard Emma's comment earlier about a totally white figure, so we definitely heard that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because if it was totally white, how did it have any features? But perhaps it was white with shades. Oh, Ian says, no, keep talking. Oh, be careful what you wish for, Ian. I could go on all night. I've got 9 books worth.
The old Berlin. Ah, Dave Sivia, heard a voice.
Thanks, Stu.
Downstairs. I'm just going down through everybody. Okay. Oh, Jiggly says in there, ask most people do they believe in the fairies. They'll laugh at you as if you're joking, but ask them to cut down a special tree or close a gate in a certain field, and they'll tell you shouldn't do that. I do like.
Yes.
Okay, taken us all the way through, and there is no further questions. So I'm going to ask one.
Cool.
You've had a number of experiences over the year yourself, haven't you?
Yeah.
And in your books, you talk about your friends' experiences quite often and people you've met along the way. But have you come across 2 people who have experienced the same ghost but not known about it?
I've got a really, I might have talked about this before, but I've got a really interesting set of correlations in a little town, well, a little village actually called Wylde in Bedfordshire.
So,
yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, if you've got the time, I'd love to hear about it.
Oh, absolutely. I found the snippet. It's a little snippet that you'll find in other ghost books about a farmer who was working on the edge of his field, doing something with a ditch. There was a hedge at the edge of the field, and he suddenly heard galloping hooves and the sound of a horse crashing through this hedge next to him. And the sound of it then galloped off down the lane, but there was nothing to be seen. And I went out on Risley's social media, and I think I'm now up to 9, I think it's 9, different people have at some point over the last 3 decades experienced an equine type entity of one type or another, and they didn't know of each other, and they didn't know of this original. So I can't remember them all off the top of my head, all 9 of them, but to give you an example, there was one lady was coming home from a night out with friends in the car, and as they drove towards the village, it caught in the main beam of the car in front of them. Risley is a very small village, and it has a lot of very small leafy lanes leading to it. The figure of a horse suddenly jumped out of a hedge on one side of the road, galloped across the road, and jumped out of sight through the other hedge, caught in the main beam of the car. But the weird thing about it was, although it was clearly the figure of a horse, it was just the outline, not coloured in at all. So you could see through it, but you could see its outline. That completely freaked out everybody in the car, as it would do. Another chap spoke to me and said his cottage is on the high street in the village and has no front garden, so the front door opens straight onto the high street. And he'd open the door one evening, probably to put milk bottles out or have a sneaky cigarette or something, at around or just after midnight. And he stood there enjoying the night air, because it's the kind of village where there's very few streetlights or anything, so you get really nice dark skies. When he heard the sound of a horse clip-clopping slowly down the high street towards him. And he thought to himself, who on earth is riding a horse at this time of night? And then he thought, oh my God, is somebody stealing a horse? So he's sort of looking up the high street, worried that somebody might be stealing a horse. And the sound comes towards him and past him and on down the high street until it faded out with never anything to see. And he said, I'll never be able to explain that. He said, and people have tried telling me that I perhaps heard a Coke can rolling in the wind or something, an empty Coke can. He said, but everybody knows that a Coke can does not sound the same as a clopping horse. Another lady had gone to call her horses in. She's got actual horses. Bring them in and put them in the stable overnight, and they were all very agitated. And she suddenly realised that there was another horse in the next field over that was glowing slightly, and that's what seemed to be agitating them. And then there were a couple who were out for a Sunday afternoon stroll, and they were intending to do a sort of circular route, leave the village, go round some lanes, cross some fields, footpaths, and back round to the starting point. And they got their dog with them. And as they walked down one of the lanes, they could hear the other side of the hedge a horse stamping and snorting and seeming to be quite annoyed about the presence of their dog. And it was in the field that they were intending to get to the end of this hedge, turn right at and cross the field. So they started having a conversation about, well, perhaps we ought to change our route, because if this horse is upset and it can't even see the dog, this could be quite nasty, sort of thing. And the husband had said, well, we'll just have a look, because there might be a fence between where it is and where we're going to walk, in which case it'll be fine. It can snort as much as it wants. Bear in mind, this is broad daylight. This is a nice sunny Sunday afternoon. So they reach the end of this hedge, turn right off the lane into the field across the end of the hedge, and peer carefully round it to see if this horse is contained by a fence or anything. Only to realise they can see for, a mile or two in every direction, and there is no horse. And not only is there no horse, there are no cattle, there are no sheep, there are no livestock of any description. It's arable fields. So what on earth that was that had followed them along that hedge, stamping and snorting at them, who knows? And there are several more, but yes, all in the same area and all equine related. And none of them knew each other, because I actually went and did a talk at their cafe in the village, and a load of them attended that, and we had quite a good discussion about it. And they didn't know each other, or they knew each other from the village by sight, maybe, some of them, but a couple had come in who used to live in the village and had an experience and didn't know that anybody else was having an experience. So yeah, I really do get correlations. And I noticed that somebody asked, how do I get the public to come forward and tell me this is, and the simple answer is I ask. They knew what to tell me. And I think I've seem to have built up a knack of being able to get people to answer me, so much so that I got a happy little troll in Scotland once, who, when I put out one of my posts asking for information, below it in big capital letters put warning. Oh, I just pulled my thing out. Warning, this is some sort of a scam. I've seen this lady asking similar questions, but about a different place in North Yorkshire. So I thought, I don't normally answer trolls, but I thought I better had, because I can understand why he thinks that's odd that he's seen me in both Scotland and North Yorkshire. So I just answered, so it's okay, I am a real author, and yes, I will have one out in North Yorkshire at the time. If you Google my name, you'll see all sorts of television interviews and radio interviews and podcast interviews and newspaper articles and all the stuff about my books on there, to reassure you it's not a scam. He just wrote back, I have, and I still think it's a scam. But okay, walk away from that one. But usually people are fine. They reach out back. I get a lot of people make stupid comments, of course, but you just ignore them and concentrate on the people that want to have a conversation.
I was just wondering which sort of media you use to ask the public for their towns.
Whichever one I can get onto that's in their location. So I use Twitter, I use LinkedIn, I use Pinterest, and I use Facebook, mostly. But I've also been known, if it's close enough, to put cards up in shop windows as well. So yeah, just, but you have to be willing to spend hours trolling through the rubbish that comes with that. Because one of the things people will do is, if you put a post out and they're interested in it, there's a thing you can do where you put an F on it and it alerts your computer to follow the discussion, apparently. I don't know. So you will have to scroll through hundreds and hundreds of Fs to get to somebody who's actually made a comment worth reading. And I always give them the option to email me and message me. And so I get a lot of emails and then private messages as well. But yeah, it's just hours of patience, really, dealing with nonsense of social media to get to the people who actually want to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Alan Murdy, also from Bury St Edmunds, is here tonight. No, I don't think he went to the same school as us. You can ask.
Oh, good evening.
Hi,
I'm
Alan.
actually hello, Ruth. Very, very nice to see you again. I am actually speaking to you from Bury St Edmunds tonight. So, and it is actually remarkable, curious fact, how many ghost hunters Bury St Edmunds seems to have engendered and produced. Not apart from your good self and Chris, if I include myself in the ranks, but there's also the current treasurer of the Ghost Club, Mark Otwell, is from Bury St Edmunds, as is the treasurer, Paul Fulsham. So is there a Bury St Edmunds effect? I'm beginning to wonder, because we also had Thurston Hopkins in the past.
Don't forget Carl Grove, and I think we really should consider, although he wasn't a ghost hunter, M.R. James.
Well, indeed, yeah. It's this is a weird geographical phenomenon in itself. But leaving that aside, that was a really very interesting talk indeed.
Good.
And
Thank
it
you.
strikes me as what you've succeeded in doing here is accumulate. I mean, this is looking at from an ASSAP point of view, a database of profound significance, reflecting on just how widespread these kind of experiences, whatever view we take of them, are amongst the population at large. And it's it's a real aspect of human experience which is currently not being fully addressed by mainstream psychology. I think it's probably Professor Ronald Hutton in his book on modern paganism, who towards the end, who actually says, well, the reason why people end up turning to paganism and witchcraft is there is a significant number of the population who are deemed physically, mentally, and psychologically normal, on whose word you would rely, who seem to have an extraordinary set of experiences. And of course, what you've succeeded in doing here is collecting what I believe, and what every survey seems to indicate, is a vast amount of human experience, which is continual, it's ongoing.
Oh,
it was occurring to the Victorians, and it's occurring today. In probably the same proportions. And I was making a few notes on some of the things you said. I mean, the Bronze Age story is a classic, because there's only really one other Bronze Age ghost of any note, which is the Phantom Horseman of Bottlebush Down in Dorset, which was seen by the archaeologist Dr. R.C. Clay, who was the grandfather of the late Robert Snow, who was General Secretary of the Ghost Club for a number of years. And
I've got another Bronze Age ghost.
Oh, right. Oh, this is
I've got one on the Isle of Wight. If I remember rightly, the lady was a solicitor.
Mm-hmm.
Might be remembering that wrongly, but I think it was a solicitor. And her husband were walking on the Downs to live on the Isle of Wight. And it was one of those summer mornings where the mist is sitting in the valleys, kind of lovely, crisp summer morning, bit of mist hanging around. And they were on the top of the Downs on the Isle of Wight, and they suddenly heard drumming hoofbeats. And out of the mist, across the top of the hill and then back down into the mist, goes a shaggy, not much bigger than a pony horse with a almost naked male rider on it, wearing, sort of little more than a sort of lion cloth and hanging onto the mane, wild hair streaming in the wind, and disappears into the mist, and the sound disappeared instantly. And she described that as being very Bronze Age in appearance. So, yeah.
You could also,
but that they are few and far between.
The SPR offers the recreation of the ghost of Necton Smear, the battle thereof, in
That's right. Yeah.
State 4, I believe. So there you go. I think it's not really Bronze Age, it's more Iron Age, but it's definitely of that ilk. So there
I
are
mean, there are a few, but they're fairly rare.
They are rare.
What you mentioned about the outline of the horse is eerily reminiscent of a very little known sighting in the 1990s, about 14 miles north of Bury St Edmunds, of two witnesses seeing what they described as a kind of stick man figure crossing the road, which occurred to two acquaintances of the science editor of 40 Times, Ian Simmons, who's given me their names and details. That occurred at Elvedon, which is northwest of Bury St Edmunds. And the outline of the glowing horse, or we just mentioned the glowing horse, reminds me of a story I heard 24 years ago. Funnily enough, from a witness far afield in a town about 2 hours north of Bogota in Colombia, who described an encounter with two luminous bulls. Make of that what one wishes. But coming back to, however, I mean, there's clearly a large number of people who have these experiences. What I wondered is if you ever actually ask them what I termed the D question, which was one imparted to me by the late Andrew Green, who was an active ghost hunter for many, many years. And it's when you come across a story of a repeat experiencer, somebody who has huge numbers of experiences, you know, a touch of the O'Donnells, you might say, or they come up with an experience unlike any other you have. There is one quite telling question, which he used to ask. You have to put it tactfully, or it sometimes comes out. Can I contact your doctor?
I have never asked that of anybody, I can honestly say.
Because that question can be quite revealing if you haven't already ascertained that the person has some kind of medical condition, or certainly something that requires medication. Because sometimes you can get rid of a ghost simply by addressing somebody's medication, and it will vanish. You know, they stop taking an overdose. I mean, we live in an oversubscribed pharmaceutical community and era, unlike any generation in the past. And there are huge social passions here, but it can be a medical question. I mean, you have to treat it immensely sensitively, of course, but that was the one thought that occurred to me. Ask them the D question. I find that usually if you say, can I contact your doctor, if the case is genuine, particularly if it involves physical phenomena, they say, do what you like, anything, get rid of it. We don't want it. If they start to really put obstacles in the way, if you can't, draw your own conclusions, one must approach it, I think, with caution as to whether there's any paranormality there. Saying that, equally, I do not discount the possibility that taking certain drugs, narcotics, legal or illegal, may encourage psi experiences. But it's the medical aspect of this, the clinical aspect, I think, is an important factor.
I mean, I must admit, most of my witnesses I have quite a short conversation with, because most people don't want to get into this to any great detail with anybody, because that whole I don't want to be made fun of. I don't want to have my name published everywhere, which is why at least 99% of my entries are pseudonyms, to protect the people's identities, because they just wouldn't talk to me otherwise, is the bottom line. They agree to have it published, they agree to talk to me, but on condition that I don't reveal who they are, and in many cases exactly which house we're talking about, if we're talking about a house. And I recognise that means that stymies a line of scientific inquiry without a doubt. But by the same token, I see my role as slightly different, which is just to gather the information that people are willing to give, and let other greater minds make of what they will of it. It did spark an interesting thought in me when you just said about my database, which is actually 3 databases now, bludgeoning into 4 because I've had to start an American one. I really ought to think about including them in my will to leave them to someone when I go, oughtn't I? Because you're right, there is a huge amount of data in there. I mean, it would be quite difficult for anybody else to read it because it's in my own personal short notes to myself. But I'm sure they could figure their way through most of it if somebody had to. But yes, so, I mean, it is interesting because my interest is in finding the correlations. And like I say, if I try to ask too many questions of people, I find that they get scared of the whole fact that I'm actually going to publish this.
Which is
so yeah, you have to balance your choices, don't you? Yeah. But yes, some people who have very long-winded, shall we say, encounters with the paranormal, I have chosen to leave out some of what they tell me. Because as I said earlier, I won't embellish or change or try to put my own spin on what somebody says. But I will choose to think, do you know what? I'm not sure that was actually true, what you just said there. You know, I think you were probably dreaming or asleep, or you're putting. So I choose to leave some out, which I can do as an author because obviously I've got a limited amount of words I can fit in any given book. So I choose the stronger of what they've told me, you know, the more interesting elements. So I do use that kind of caution, but yeah, other than that, I'm afraid it has to just go by the what people are willing to give, really.
If you're wondering who to leave the databases to, you might want to consider ASSAP's archives. I'm saying that because I'm ASSAP's archivist.
Yeah, I was just thinking I could quite easily leave them to all 3, couldn't I? ASSAP and the Ghost Club and Peter.
Yeah, absolutely. You could leave them to everyone because they are. One of the things I was going to ask you is, I mean, my childhood home, you know, we went to St. James. You didn't go to St. James as well, did you, Alan, by any chance? Is Alan still there? Can you hear me, Ruth?
I can hear you, yeah.
No, I did not. No.
Both St. James students, you see. There you go. But, yeah. One of the great pioneers of ghost hunting in West Suffolk and Bury St Edmunds was a chap called Eric Quigley, who's still alive today. He's living in Cheltenham. I don't see him very often. But Eric is a good friend, and he got me interested in the whole subject to some extent. And back in 88, 89, I had a very strange experience with hen mouse at Elvedon. But when I was growing up, I grew up between Elvedon, Ingham, and Livermere, and that on a farm there. Our first phone number was Elvedon 250, and there is a magnificently weird coincidence involving Elvedon, involving a death and 3 gamekeepers that repeats a century apart. It's a real case, real murders, and the only thing close to it I can think of is the Erdington murder, which I'm sure is something that Alan is aware of. A coincidence, an unfortunate coincidence of names around a Barbara Forrest who was murdered on the outskirts of Erdington, and a chap called Thornton who was arrested but then released when found innocent. And that happened twice, 100 and so many years apart. But there's a very similar occurrence that occurred up on the Elvedon estate. Anyway, enough of that. I was just going to ask, do you have any ghost stories from Elvedon?
I was just thinking, it rings a bell, and I was just trying to see if I could get my database to open, or one of them.
The A11 runs down through Elvedon. My sisters were back in the 60s ran a burger van by the Elvedon Memorial. So there you go. They sat there all times of day and night, the 2 girls, selling hot dogs and beef burgers to people. I have to ask them if they've got any weird stories from out there. There's UFO. I know that, but our story dates from, I think it was Easter 88 or 89, but without looking at my diaries, I can't tell you which.
It's not in my ghosts. Is it Elva done with a D-O-N?
No, it's ELVE, Elveden, ELVEDEN.
D-E-N.
It's in the sort of Norfolk Suffolk border area.
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I'll send you the stories I've got from Suffolk.
Please do. Please do.
Quite a few of them. I collected a lot back in the 80s and 90s as well. So, yeah. Okay, well, we've also got Kaz saying Erdington, what a place. Erdington is actually quite an interesting place. I was living there for a while with a girlfriend in a place called Sutton Coldfield, Warmley, which is close to Erdington. And there were quite a few interesting stories from around there. But I'm going to ask one last question, if I may, because I know that you're usually happy to talk, Ruth, but for as long as it takes. Oh, 2 more people have entered now. Let's just let them in. Let Ed in. Ed's got a ghost story about a dead horse. Ed, can you flog your dead horse story, please? Are you there, Ed Woods?
Yeah, sorry, my bucket getting kicked out for some reason. Yeah, I'm here now, yeah. Yep.
Okay, do you want to read out your account? You wrote it in the chat, or maybe Ruth could just read it there.
Yeah, well, this is about, I didn't hear you because I imagined you just talk about the thing I just posted, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I was down in Taunton and I was working in I think it was a recruitment agency down there in 2008, April 2008. There was a fellow there, he got onto the subject of ghost stories and he told me a couple of ones, or in fact, there was a couple of people there and they were discussing ghost stories. And one of the ones he described, he said he was driving down, there's a tiny little hamlet near Wellington, it's just near the M5, and it's called Nicholas Shane. And he said he was driving along this lane at night, and he saw this horse coming towards him. It was quite a big, powerful sort of horse, I guess maybe a Shire horse or something. It was coming towards him down this narrow lane, and he was trying to get past it because it was a big, powerful animal. He didn't want it to bump into the car. And it was coming towards him, so he managed to squeeze past it. And as he went past, he could see the face of this horse, and the eyes were dead, and the face was all limp, and it looked dead, but it was still going on. So he carried on to the nearest farm, and he asked the farmers there. And he said, "Well, people there," he says, "Did one of your horses get out? I've seen this horse in the lane." And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's a ghost." They said, other people have seen it." And they just told him other people have seen it. So he wasn't the first person to account it. I haven't been able to find any records of it though, but it was quite interesting, I thought.
I don't think I'd like to see a dead-looking horse galloping along.
Well, a zombie horse coming from the end on turn.
Well, sorry? Yeah, I think he was in a car, but I suppose he could reverse back out the lane again. But I think it was until he got level with it, he looked at it, and he could see that it looked dead. But it was sort of moving towards him very sort of slowly. It wasn't galloping or anything. I got the impression it was sort of slowly, sort of limping down the lane, or moving slowly down the lane anyway, not galloping or anything. But it just looked dead, and he said the eyes looked, dead eyes on it. But yeah, it sounded very creepy. But I have to find out what it is. Try to find out something more about it, but I haven't been able to, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame.
Ed is a researcher of British road ghosts, so Ruth, maybe you could get him to provide you with some of his stories because he's got.
Yes, please.
Let me do that.
I've got quite a few on the road ghost database, so there'll be a roadmap 3 at some point in the future.
Okay, cheers, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much to Ruth. I don't know if Alan's still around, but I think I just sort of went with Day and Philip Paul, both of whom I believe spent parts of their lives living in Bury or very close to Bury St Edmunds. So maybe people who live in Bury St Edmunds just end up haunted by it. Maybe it's the trauma of West Suffolk County Council. But jokes aside, it's lovely to hear from you all. It's always great to catch up with Ruth. And Next week, Claire, are you here? Are you with us, Claire? Are you with us, Claire? No. I'll just see if I can find out who's next week. And we'll have Ruth back. Apparently, next week's webinar, May the 2nd, is Jean-Michel Abressart. No, that was last week. So I don't know who it is next week, but hopefully we will have another speaker next week, perhaps looking at the Three Crowns anomaly. Why do so many ghost hunters come from Bury St Edmunds? Or possibly more serious. Anyway, till that time, you really need to go, because I think on +1 now you'll probably be able to watch Eurovision semi-final too. So good luck to everybody on Eurovision, especially to our international members. God bless everyone. Keep safe. See you all next week. Thank you very much. Good night. Good night.
Good night.